These are the best boss fights ever, objectively, even though you've probably never even heard of some of them, or maybe even all of them. Just one quick rule for the list, only one boss fight per franchise. Otherwise, half of this list would be bosses from 3D Sonic games. And honestly, I could make a whole other video just talking about Sonic the Hedgehog bosses. Number 10, this big steam guy from Brave Fencer Musashi. Steam Knight. If you've never heard of Brave Fencer Musashi, do yourself a favor and go play it. It was basically Square Enix's answer to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. You play as a cool and cheesy 90s anime boy, and you go around adventuring and fighting cool bosses, like this guy, Steam Knight. The fight isn't that special mechanically, but just the whole presentation behind it is really cool. Musashi is the embodiment of the cocky 90s anime hero, and just seeing him being intimidated, even ever so briefly, by this big robot guy with a wrecking ball, makes you all like, whoa!
Are you asking for a challenge?
And his boss fight is tied up nicely with a neat little bow. This video is gonna have spoilers, by the way. I won't go into story details, but if you care about the mechanics of certain boss fights that I mentioned in the video, you might want to skip ahead a little bit over certain sections, if you get to a game you haven't played yet. Anyway, at the end of this battle with Steam Knight, you get to throw his own weapon back on top of him, just like this.
Hey, you forgot something!
What a heroic main theme song. Also, it was included in the 1998 PlayStation Interactive Sampler CD, which is pretty cool. Number 9, Bowser in Super Mario 64. I know there are a lot of cool Bowser fights, but I had to go with Mario 64 just because of the impact it had at the time. Once Sunshine Galaxy and Odyssey came around, these epic climactic battles with Bowser would become old news. But this first one in 3D was so cool. The dark lighting, the flames everywhere, the intimidating music, the scary floating platform that turns into a star as Bowser breaks it apart, the rainbow effect you get in the final battle against him, it's all super cool. It's just a shame that the DS version of the game didn't have the same atmosphere. Number 8, Red from Pokémon Gold, Silver, and Crystal version. This is the best boss in a Game Boy game and the best boss in a Pokémon game. Getting to the very end of the post-game and finding out that the final boss is you from the last game? That's such a cool idea. And he's got a level 81 Pikachu on his team. That's such a higher level than every other Pokemon you've faced in the game. And it makes him feel like Ash Ketchum. I know he's not Ash, but Ash was the face of the anime for so many years. It's cool that you get to face off against someone kind of similar to him in the games. Later Pokemon games wish they could be that cool. Number 7. Yeah, he's a meme, but this boss fight against Sans is so good. Number 6, the fight against Frieza in the first Dragon Ball Z Budokai game. This is one of those boss fights that's sort of carried by the music, as well as just the build-up to it. The boss fight itself isn't all that spectacular. It's just sort of par the course for that game. Aside from the fact that it's the first time you become a Super Saiyan, there's all this build-up, and then the music during it is just so great. Number 5, Jiraiya vs. Pain in Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 2. The cutscenes in this game were just so good. The presentation is so similar to the anime, you could honestly get away with just playing it instead of watching the anime or reading the manga. In fact, that's what I did for part of it. About halfway through my viewing of Naruto Shippuden, I just sort of checked out and played the Ultimate Ninja Storm games instead. They do such a good job of recapping and summarizing everything in a way that's just so cool and cinematic, with good music, good lighting, stunning cel-shaded graphics that are honestly sort of hard to tell apart from the anime in some still shots at times. And I'd say this fight against Pain is the most impactful of all of them. No spoilers here, but I'll just say this fight is really important for story reasons. And seeing those important story beats carried out in 1080p 60 frames per second, high quality, high definition cinematics is a fantastic experience. Number 4, the fight against Liquid Ocelot in Metal Gear Solid 4. I had a really hard time deciding between this and the fight against Senator Armstrong in Metal Gear Rising, but I had to pick this powerful conclusion to an epic saga. MGS4 just has so much fan service and wacky Hideo Kojima antics if you're into that. The fight against Armstrong was wacky too, but only within the context of that game. This fight against Liquid Ocelot had been what the series had been building up to for years, and just hearing the different game themes play one after the other, while two shirtless old guys punch each other on top of a giant robot, what's not to like? Number 3, Asch von Fabre from Tales of the Abyss. Again, this fight's all about the build-up. the music, the setting, just the overall presentation. And then of course there's the
Replica!
Yuri Lowenthal giving it his best, as always. Just a top-notch voice actor. If you don't recognize the name, chances are you still know this guy's voice. He was Sasuke in Naruto, Simone in the dub of Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, Haseo in .hack GU, the protagonist in Persona 3, Yosuke in Persona 4, Lord Farron in Guild Wars 2, Beck in Mighty No. 9, Chandlo in Bugsnax, Spider-Man in Spider-Man. I could go on. Number 2, Sephiroth. From Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Kingdom Hearts, and Kingdom Hearts 2. I couldn't just pick one of these versions. All 4 of them are so good. I can't believe they didn't include him as a secret boss in Kingdom Hearts 3. The original Final Fantasy VII Sephiroth is great, not only because they spent the entire game building him up, ever since you first run into him in Cloud's hometown. You see him just walking away from the flames all menacingly. You're like, yeah, this guy's pretty badass. He's so cool and intimidating. But with Sephiroth, it's not just the music and presentation. All of his boss fights are fun and mechanically interesting too. Normally I don't care too much about straight up difficulty in games, but Sans Undertale and the fights against Sephiroth are the 2 exceptions. It's just so satisfying to finally conquer them. Look at how long his sword is! And the attacks he uses. Supernova from the original Final Fantasy VII? This move takes 2 whole minutes. Every time he uses this technique, you have to just sit there and watch the whole thing play out for 2 whole minutes. That's so silly. Before number 1, here are some honorable mentions, many of which I couldn't include on the list since they're from game series I already mentioned. Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear Solid. Yeah, the concept is kinda cheesy and dated now, but I'd definitely be remiss not to at least mention the boss that recites what games are on your memory card and tricks you into thinking you're on a different input mode, or that your save file's being erased. And you have to beat him by plugging the controller into a different controller slot. That's such a clever idea. Egg Cerberus. Mechanically, this isn't the best boss fight, but conceptually, it's one of the coolest Eggman robots that wasn't a playable character. Except for maybe the Death Egg robot. One guy, no rings? What were they thinking? You have to fight Metal Sonic in the lead up to him, there's no checkpoints, it's got cool, menacing music, and yeah, there may have been more difficult bosses in video games from that era, but none of them were as cool looking as this guy. Getting back to Egg Cerberus, usually if the Eggman robots aren't shaped like Eggman, they're just these generic flying machines. Sometimes they're shaped like an eagle or whatever, but this one was a big robot dog. That's pretty cool. The boss fight is a little janky, which is part of why it didn't make the list, but the concept is really cool to me. And yeah, the boss fights in Sonic Frontiers may have been way cooler in the moment, but I feel like the designs aren't quite as memorable as something like this, so I'm gonna give it to the doggy. Glass Galblian from Mabinogi. I had to include at least one boss from Mabinogi, my favorite MMORPG of all time, on the list. And this is the best one I can think of. Except for maybe the Succubus? Glass Galblian is the first major boss in Mabinogi. The one that you fight at the end of Gen 3. Even though it takes a stupid amount of time to complete, all this time, all the quests leading up to this, it's worth the wait. This guy is so much more intimidating than anything else up until that point in the game. There may have been more intimidating bosses later in the game, but it's just so difficult making story progress in that game. This is the only one I was able to get to. Maybe someday I can go back and complete all the other generations? I would love that. So hear me out. Ralph in the Western level of Animaniacs on the Sega Genesis. If anyone was ever going to take a boss from this game, I think they'd probably pick the final boss against Pinky and the Brain. But when I look back at games from my early childhood, this one stands out a little more, just because of the creativity behind it. Like, you're on this train, you've got to whack the coal into the train to make it go faster. I can't remember the other bosses in this game very well, but this one just really stood out to me for some reason. King Dedede from Kirby's Dream Land. Yeah, there may have been way cooler bosses later on in the Kirby series, but like many of the bosses on this list, it wins out for me just by virtue of the impact it had at the time. This was the best boss in an action game on the Game Boy. Best boss period on the Game Boy of course goes to Red, like I mentioned earlier. The Leviathan from Final Fantasy XV. It's perfect chaos, but in a Final Fantasy game, with way better graphics. Noct even goes super Noct. This boss fight is so cool, I really wish I could have included it on the list, but Sephiroth's so iconic I just had to give it to him. GLaDOS in Portal. I feel like Portal 2 probably had the stronger ending overall, mainly because of the moment where you discover what you have to do. But as far as character depth goes, it's hard to beat the OG psychotic robot mastermind. Spyro the Dragon is another example of a series that had cooler boss fights in later entries, but the Nasty Nork fight is just so much more fun than, say, Ripto. I hate when you have to just whittle down health bars in boss fights, but when a platforming game actually tests your ability in platforming and speed rather than just your combat, that's what really wins me over. Ganondorf and Ganon in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. I can't believe a Zelda boss didn't make the list, to be honest. But there are just so many cool bosses in video games. And while, yeah, Ganon is cool, I feel like he's just a bit too generic demon monster-y. Tears of the Kingdom and Majora's Mask are probably my favorite Zelda games, but I have to admit Ocarina of Time has the better final boss. Despite devolving into a big fight against the generic demon monster thing, Ganondorf is just so menacing with that organ music as you ascend his tower, and the boss fight itself is cool too. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance just didn't quite make the cut. Which is sad, because...
Nanomachine, son!
And finally, Neocortex in Crash Bandicoot Warped. Having another battle going on that you have to avoid while you're actively fighting the final boss is such a cool idea. And again, good music, cool atmosphere, the best boss in a Crash Bandicoot game, by far. Number 1. The Final Hazard from Sonic Adventure 2. And Perfect Chaos from Sonic Adventure 1. I'm cheating, I'm sorry, they're just both so cool. Perfect Chaos is definitely the better design conceptually. I mean, it's this giant watery god of destruction. Obviously a big lizard isn't going to stand a chance in comparison, but the way they set up the Biohazard fight may ultimately make it the better boss fight. It's just so cool flying in space with Live and Learn playing in the background. This giant lizard is pulling a space colony into the Earth. It's so silly, but I love it. The build-up, the aftermath, your friends shouting to you over the radio as it's happening. Just everything about it is so good. So yeah, that's my dumb list of the top 10 bosses in games. What did I miss? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see one of my other top 10s, go look at my top 10 list on the top 10 3DS games. Also join the Discord. I want to chat with you guys about cool video game bosses. Thanks for watching.